WVW Broadcast Network and The New American are pleased to present The New American TV with your host, Rebecca Terrell. This broadcast is committed to helping you understand the truth behind the news. And now, here's your host, Rebecca Terrell.
Welcome to The New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Today is Friday, February 24th, and we have a special presentation for you today. Mr. Arthur Thompson is CEO Emeritus of the John Birch Society. He's also author of the book, International Merger by Foreign Entanglements. He offers this overview of the agenda to trade away our free trade under the guise of free trade partnerships. Let's take a look.
Thank you for coming. Before we get started, we like to ask a few questions. Have you ever bought a product and found it wasn't what was advertised? Sure. Have you ever voted for a politician and didn't get what was promised? Of course, we all have. It's the same with the package called free trade. It is not what is being presented. Let's look at what a couple of the founding fathers said about trade, or in their words, commerce. First, George Washington gave us a warning in his farewell address in 1796. He said, "'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with a portion of the foreign world." Now, he didn't mean any particular portion, he meant any portion of the foreign world. Thomas Jefferson continued Washington's warning about foreign alliances, but added commerce into the mix. In 1799, he said, quote, "Commerce with all nations, alliance with none, shall be our motto," unquote. 2 years later, he said, quote, "I deem the essential principles of our government peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none," unquote. As you can see, Jefferson affirmed the goodness of foreign commerce, but at the same time strongly warned us against entangling alliances. In the beginning, we had foreign entanglements, but eliminated them by 1800, and did not get involved with them again until we joined the United Nations 145 years later. So to summarize what our founders told us about trade and foreign alliances, trade is good, while entangling alliances are bad. And, as a brief review, recall that the purpose of the United States government can be boiled down to 1, maintaining our national independence. What was the first document that we studied in school about our American system? It was the Declaration of Independence. It sets down the basic philosophy for our Constitution and our system of government. Independence is the most important responsibility of our government. Without independence, we cannot maintain our Constitution or our Bill of Rights, let alone make our own decisions as a people. Rarely, if ever, do neoconservatives and those who advocate free trade ever discuss our independence and the need to maintain it. The next purpose of government is to protect our God-given rights, which include life, liberty, and property. On the other hand, government was not established to regulate business, form permanent alliances, or abrogate the Constitution. Yet these things are done on an almost daily basis, especially with executive orders. The Constitution granted Congress the exclusive power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, which means that the Constitution did not grant any power to the President or executive branch to regulate commerce. Let me repeat this last point for emphasis. The Constitution did not grant any power to the President or executive branch to regulate foreign commerce. And Congress meant both houses, not simply the Senate. For a large part of our nation's history, Congress regulated trade with tariffs, a fee charged by government for permitting imports or exports of products. These tariffs were a main source of revenue for the federal government and were also used to protect certain domestic industries. This continued until the 1930s. Recently, we have undergone subtle changes in how we implement international commerce, from acts by Congress to agreements that include much more than commerce, to partnerships which are including the merger of much of our economy and society, including our police and military. Since 2005, we're hearing more about partnerships. As the slide indicates, partnership normally refers to a legal relationship between two or more persons. When we apply the word partnership to relationships between nations, you can see that the governments of these nations are working together in governing their block of nations no longer independent. The government leaders are using the partnership terminology to the extent that they are planning the economic and political integration of the nations involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. At this point, let's discuss what free trade is. Free trade is defined as international trade that is free of such government interference as import quotas, export subsidies, and protective tariffs. Let's provide a little history of the free trade policy. In 1776, Scottish economist and moral philosopher Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, which established a new trade policy called free trade. It featured the reduction of tariffs and regulations on trade. Now, we're not criticizing classical free trade policy as established by Adam Smith. However, we do criticize the present-day free trade policy that consists of negotiating complex trade agreements or partnerships between nations that do reduce tariffs, but also include provisions for managed trade as well as many other entanglements. We call this the free trade agenda. Let's move on to an example of how a merger was sold as free trade, that of Europe. It was done a step at a time, gradually accelerating into the European Union. Now, at first, the people were sold on the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952 among 6 nations. They included France and Germany. The next free trade agreement established the European Economic Community in 1957. Next came the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, which established the European Union. Finally, the Lisbon Treaty of 2007, which established an EU constitution. The people of Europe were told they would be able to vote on the constitution. Once the people of France and the Netherlands rejected the constitution in their vote, no other country was allowed to vote again, and the EU constitution was ratified by treaty at Lisbon in 2007. In other words, the people of the member states of the European Union lost the independence of their respective nations without a vote of the people. With the loss of independence came the loss of the ability to determine their own future. Now the European Union has 28 formally independent nations, which are now known as member states, and adding to that number almost every year. Now, these states are virtually under the complete control of the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Central Bank, and a Court of Justice of the European Union. Every nation that has been added to the EU has lost its independence without a vote of the people. Not only have they lost their independence to the EU, their very own constitution subordinates every member state to the United Nations. Many different agreements and treaties have been signed since 1951 to build the European Union. There are quite a number of these. And each was a salami slice made to look harmless, until the European socialists had accomplished their goal of a superstate for Europe, the dream of Napoleon, Hitler, and Stalin. Just how were the Europeans deceived? This is what Bernard Connolly, former EU official, had to say about it. Quote, "It has now become clear to us that what we thought was a common market is nothing more than a project to create a European federal superstate in which our sovereignty, Britain's national identity, would be extinguished." In 2003, Christopher Booker and Richard North published a book called The Great Deception, subtitled The Secret History of the European Union. They called the EU, quote, "a slow-motion coup d'etat, the most spectacular coup d'etat in history. An even bigger coup d'etat is already being negotiated by the United States and the European Union." Let's look again at how our trade policy evolved. First, the Constitution gave Congress power to regulate foreign trade in 1787. Then in the 1930s, Congress started to delegate trade policy authority to the President. And then in the 1970s, Congress began to cede more trade policy authority to the President with fast-track authority. What is fast-track? Congress gives the President authority to negotiate trade agreements. That requires Congress to vote completed agreements up or down within 60 days with no amendments or filibusters. Fast track was in effect in 1974 through 1994, and then again in 2002 through 2007. Now Obama wants it back. Fast track has enabled the free trade agenda to move forward. NAFTA and other free trade agreements have come during the fast track years. Now let's look at the progress towards a merger of Canada, Mexico, and the United States into a North American Union. In 1979, presidential candidate Ronald Reagan kicked things off with his announcement of his strong support for a North American Accord, which, with hindsight, can be seen as the embryonic proposal for a North American Union. In 1989, under President George H.W. Bush, we got the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, our nation's first free trade agreement. This led to a large trade deficit with Canada. One of the reasons we were told we needed the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which we got under Bill Clinton in 1994, between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. NAFTA laid the foundation for the Security and Prosperity Partnership in 2005 under President George W. Bush, which quickly took on the nickname North American Union. This was curtailed during Bush's tenure by the intervention of the John Birch Society. Obama has now reinstituted the process under such names as the North American Leaders Summits to disguise what's going on. To sum up what we've just been saying, no matter what the administration, whether it was Republican or Democrat, they have been negotiating treaties, so-called free trade treaties, that have involved us in foreign entanglements. And they range from trying to evolve us from the free trade area of Americas to the NAFTA agreement, to the Security and Prosperity Partnership, and now into these other partnerships with Europe and the Pacific. Now we have a new partnership our government is working on, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Right now it involves 12 nations in the Pacific Rim. It's going to be a European Union type bloc for the Asia-Pacific region. Ultimately, they want all 21 nations of APEC, or the Asia-Pacific Economic Corporation, to economically and politically integrate our countries. This includes China and Russia. What will that mean to be economically and politically integrated? It will mean the loss of our independence in our economics and our political government. That's literally what it means. In addition, we're involved in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That's a free trade agreement between the United States and the European Union. Now we know what free trade means in Europe. It means superstate. Free trade was only the verbiage they used to fool the Europeans into forming this huge regional government. It would lead to economic and political integration of the United States and Europe. Now, keep in mind, political and economic integration means losing our freedoms, whether it's in Asia or whether it's in Europe. Let me tell you a story about what happened to me in Europe when I was over there investigating the ramifications of the fall of the Berlin Wall for the New American Magazine. Part of what we were doing over there, we actually got in the office of the Public Relations Director for the European Community, which was the precursor of the European Union. And he said to me, looked me right in the eye across his desk and said, when we get this all together, meaning the European Union, we're going to be bigger than you geographically and economically. And we're going to drag the United States into this union, kicking and screaming if necessary. And I thought, that's very arrogant. I also thought, why aren't these other newspapers and magazines that come into his office reporting what he's saying? Because if he's saying that to me, he surely must have been saying it to them. But what we know is that these organizations, such as the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, etc., are for these free trade agreements. So they wouldn't want to report on what the European socialists really have in mind for us, and that is economic and political integration, something a lot different than free trade. Now, the John Birch Society put a halt to the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of Americas. We also put a halt to the Security and Prosperity Partnership, and we fully intend to put a halt to these partnerships that they are negotiating and trying to put on the American people. One of the tools that we've developed, and we've developed several, is a special edition of the New American Magazine. Now, in this particular issue, you can find all the details that you need about these partnerships that they are trying to impose on us. Also, we have my book, which gets into all the ramifications of foreign entanglements, not just free trade. Here is just a panorama of some of the tools that we've developed and are continuing to develop for you to use to inform people in your community about the problems with free trade. We can stop the free trade agenda with your help. These trade deals threaten our national independence, our freedoms, and our economy. It is incumbent on all of us to do something about it. First, educate yourself and then others with the tools available. Those showing you this presentation have most of them available here and now. Second, provide leadership for groups in your community. You already know more than they do about the subject. It will be up to you to lead them into a better understanding of the problem and its solution. You can get the latest updates by texting the word trade to the number 88588 on your cell phone. Or you can go to jbs.org and keep apprised of all the latest information, activities, updates, suggestions on the page Choose Freedom, Stop the Free Trade Agenda. And this will inform you how you can help defeat the free trade agenda. Thank you.
We encourage you to visit us online at jbs.org and thenewamerican.com to see this presentation as well as many others on these topics. And we'll be right back after these messages.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence proclaims God-given rights, and we intend to protect them. Working with people like you for over 50 years, preserving freedom and building a better tomorrow. Safeguarding the Constitution by limiting government power. We are restoring liberties, educating voters, and leading the freedom movement. Join with us. United, we will defend our rights. We are all Americans. We are the John Birch Society.
Sophia paused before the door. It read, Department of Bidigital Convergence. Just inside was a new world, a better world, the one of everlasting life, of no pain, of no loss, of no problem. She entered the chamber and her surroundings changed. She saw around her an infinite field of waving golden grain surmounted by cloudless blue sky. The AI voice whispered gently in her mind, Welcome to the singularity. She couldn't see it and couldn't feel it, but her body had almost instantly been covered by a swarm of tiny gray multi-legged bots that melted through her clothes and into her skin. Not perceiving the nightmare, her eyes had already been consumed and the rest of her body was dissolving as the bots digested her flesh. She felt only a warmth suffusing her being. Drowsy, she drifted to sleep, and her last thought was one of panic. Would she ever wake? Could a nightmare vision like this be an outcome of the much-hyped transhumanist technological singularity? Enter the world of the future as illuminated by the experience of the past in Endgame, the new book by Dennis Barrett, the publisher of the New American Magazine, and find out how the disastrous COVID pandemic response fits with the technocratic elite's thirst to create a transhumanist utopia. Get Endgame from shopjbs.org with free shipping with code ENDSHIP, ENDSHIP. Or get Endgame and the Great Reset Collector's issue of the New American Magazine and get free shipping plus an additional 20% off both with code END20, END20.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Steve Bonta, the Executive Senior Editor of the New American Magazine, and with me today is a very special guest. We have with us Stephen Mosher, who is a very long-time, world-respected expert on Chinese culture, politics, language. He's also the president of the Population Research Institute. This man holds 3 master's degrees, including one in oceanography, I'm given to understand, as well as twin MAs in East Asian Studies and Anthropology from Stanford University. Back in the day, more than 40 years ago, he became the first American scholar to conduct an in-depth study of a Chinese commune, and one of the very first American scholars to be granted access to China at all in the thawing out period that occurred after the end of the Cultural Revolution. So, Mr. Mosher, welcome to the program. I'd like to ask you first just a little bit, if you could just tell us a little bit about your experiences. As someone who's traveled to China myself and many other parts of Asia, it's always interesting to sort of share experiences with people who've been there. So, can you tell us a little bit about your original program of study? What brought you to China? I believe it was Guangdong in South China, and what happened there, and how it changed you.
Well, it's good to be with you and the folks at the New American and the folks at the John Birch Society. I have spoken at JBS meetings going back to the early 80s when I was first back from Asia at conferences and local chapters. So I consider myself to be among friends. And again, it's great to be with you again. I was an officer of the U.S. Navy during the 7th Fleet, became fascinated with the Far East. And so when I resigned my commission in 1976, I went to China and to Hong Kong to study at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, learn Chinese. I came back to Stanford, and I was getting a PhD in sinology when the door suddenly opened up to go to China. I had the opportunity, selected by the Carter administration, to go to China and be the first American social scientist on the ground to see what life was like in that country. Of course, the doors had been closed for 30 years, and so they were suddenly open to a number of American scholars, and I was one of them. The population control agenda, of course, has been with us since the 1960s. Unfortunately, it was imported by the United Nations Population Fund and other groups into China in around 1979, 1980. And the one-child policy began. I was in the operating room when they were forcibly aborting women who were, in some cases, 7, 8, and 9 months pregnant. They were children who were born outside the quota system, the one-child policy, were not allowed to live. And I'm glad to report that the one-child policy ended in 2016, and that now in China there's a 3-child policy. Unfortunately, the birth rate still remains very, very low, and recently in Sichuan province, they've lifted all birth restrictions. People are free to have as many children as they want. Unfortunately, we'll see if China can raise its birth rate. Many, many countries are below replacement rate fertility right now, as we would be in the United States. Our population would be shrinking over time were it not for immigration.
Well, so what are the consequences? You mentioned the way the one-child policy then was changed fairly recently to two-child and a 3-child policy, and now in Sichuan province, and perhaps soon other parts of China will follow their example, who knows, have pretty much ended it altogether. But demographically, what have been the consequences for the People's Republic of China?
Well, what's been the consequences for all of the countries that bought into the idea that babies were a burden and not a blessing, that failed to take into account the enormous contribution that human capital makes to economic development, that failed to realize that people are the ultimate resource, the one resource you cannot do without. So not just China, but of course, Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, all of Europe now, of course, is dying, filling more coffins than cradles. And so I think this is a challenge facing really all of humanity. We know how difficult it is to maintain a robust economy, even when the population is growing. It will be impossible for many countries, like Japan, for example, which lost 600,000 people last year, filled 600,000 more coffins than cradles. To continue to have any sort of economic growth, to stave off economic decline with an aging and dying population. That's a story that we see in many, many parts of the world. And yet the United States government, against the wishes, I think, of the majority of the American people, is still spending billions of dollars to try to force down the birth rate in countries where the population is already shrinking.
Well, it's interesting that this isn't a new idea. I mean, this kind of Malthusian conceit has been around for more than 2 centuries. This idea that there's an optimal level of population, and that in some sense it's government or society's responsibility to maintain that optimal population lest we become overpopulated. And so, I mean, Malthus, rather inexplicably, is still accorded the very high status and taught at universities and so forth. And obviously his modern acolyte, Paul Ehrlich, when you and I were young, of course, the Population Bomb, published in the 1970s, as well as sequel volumes, have made these similar, calamitous predictions. And one might think, if you just sort of, and of course, if you ever go to a place like China or India or Bangladesh, I spent some time in India as well, and in fact, much of Asia, there are a lot more people than there are in, say, the United States or Canada, or at least so it appears. And this was the case even hundreds of years ago. I mean, the early accounts of the British arriving in Calcutta back in the 1700s and 1800s, they would often remark on just the incredible throngs of people that they saw in the streets and the docks and everything else, in contrast to what they were accustomed to back in England. And so, people who look at this superficially, I think, are tempted to say, well, obviously it's possible to have too many people. Too many people will consume all the resources, and so we have to do something about it. What do you say to people who argue along those lines?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of topics you just brought up, but let's start with Thomas Malthus, who was actually an Anglican clergyman and should have known better, but he wasn't really at a parish or he wasn't a pastor. He was the chief economist for the British East India Company. And as you say, the British were surprised at the large population of India. And Thomas Malthus argued not so much that there was an optimal level of population. That argument came along later. He argued that population would always outstrip food supply. He said that people reproducing, they will reproduce geometrically, and agricultural increase in production, the production of food grains and foodstuffs, would only increase arithmetically, and so the one would outpace the other. And so when famine occurred in India, in one particular state in India, his advice to the British East India Company, which was running India at the time, administering the country, was not to bring in food, because the Indians were simply having too many children, and better to let them starve to death, and 10 million did, rather than bring in food. And he said that would just put off the day of starvation by 10 or 20 years or so, but starvation would be inevitable because, as he said, population will always outpace food supply. So that was a fundamentally mistaken idea. It also led to the Irish potato famine. The reason why the British let the Irish die by the millions back in the 1860s was because of the influence of Thomas Malthus, whose students, paper sons as we call them at Academe, were in charge of the British government. And they said there's simply too many people in Ireland. If we feed them now, they'll simply continue to have children, and they'll die in greater numbers later. Better to let them starve now. So that was the reaction, again, following the mistaken theories, what's called the dismal theorem of Thomas Malthus. And then we come to Paul Ehrlich, who did say in 1968 that the battle to feed humanity is over, that hundreds of millions of people will die in the 1970s. Well, he was looking primarily at places like China and India. And what happened instead of hundreds of millions of people dying in the 1970s was something called the Green Revolution, where agronomist Norman Borlaug produced new, different genetically manipulated strands of grain, kinds of grain, that dramatically increased food production. And we didn't see hundreds of million people starve to death in India. We saw India in the 1970s and 80s become an exporter of food. So again, population did not outpace food supply. I think a lot of people, when they go to crowded cities around the world, if they come from rural areas or small towns, they're surprised at the number of people. But that's what a city is. A city is a large collection of people living together. And the reason they live together is that on average, people are twice as well off in the cities as they are in the countryside. They have better access to education, better health care, better job opportunities, higher level of income. So the reason people come together in cities is precisely because they enjoy a higher living standard. And then to look around and say, there are too many people here, the city is overpopulated, is nonsensical, because if you got rid of half the people, you would eliminate the very economic opportunities that brought people together in these large urban settings in the first place. So the whole idea of overpopulation is nonsensical. Demographers, there is no definition in demography of what overpopulation is, and there can never be any definition of what overpopulation is, because people come together naturally in groups for their own benefit. And any government that interferes with that interferes with the fundamental human right of couples to decide for themselves the number and spacing of their children, or where people should live, or how to space out communities, is going to interfere with that basic freedom of people to decide where they want to live and how they want to live.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me a couple points could be extracted from this. Is number one, people who don't think very deeply about the issue tend to see humans only as consumers and never as producers and innovators. You know, and this is one of the things, I mean, right now, the population on the American continent could not have been sustained if you could magically take all 330 million of us back in time 150 years, you know, existing land under cultivation, and the actual productivity of that land was nowhere near what it is today. But our population has risen in tandem with our innovation, with our ability to create more and more efficient ways of raising crops and all the rest of this. And the same process, you know, takes place in all cultures. And the second thing is that at least in modern times, and this may be true anciently, we don't have that much data. Certainly famines are mentioned in the Bible and so forth and so on. But in modern times, when you see a famine, it's almost always because of government malfeasance of one sort or another. So in our lifetimes, you know, the two most celebrated famines, the famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s and the Somali famine in the 1990s, were both caused by civil war and government. I mean, in particular in Ethiopia, you know, Mengistu, I remember the reports were being suppressed for a time in the Western press. But the reality that came out later was that Mengistu's Marxist government was deliberately withholding food supplies from rebellious areas of Ethiopia and all the rest of it. It was absolutely horrible what was going on. And then a decade later in Somalia, the same kind of thing happened, and we had all the pictures of, you know, fly-blown children and all this type of thing with bloated bellies. But it was happening because of civil war and anarchy and all the rest of this. And the same with the great famine in Bengal. I mean, Murray Rothbard, I believe, wrote about it, how that took place during the time of World War II. And again, this was more or less a man-made famine created by mismanagement of the British government, among other factors. So, yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Now, tell me a little bit about your organization, the Population Research Institute. How long has it been around? What kind of motivated you to found it, and what are some of its objectives? What are when we talk about things like population control, besides, we mentioned forced abortions earlier, but what are we talking about here? What kinds of policies do you find objectionable?
Well, when we look at population control programs around the world, and these are programs that are funded by the United Nations, they're funded by the European Union, but they're also funded by the United States, by your tax dollars and mine. And I think if people knew what these programs consisted of, they would find them highly, highly objectionable, because they always involve government coercion in the most private decisions that couples have to make, decisions over the number and spacing of their children. And of course, we actually started the United Nations Population Fund, which is the population control agency of the United Nations, back in 1968, when Robert McNamara, who was in charge of the World Bank, sent a huge tranche of money to the UN to start its involvement in population control. And among the things that have happened over the years, for example, in Peru, under the Clinton administration, you had Al Gore going to Peru and telling the Peruvian president, there are too many babies being born in Peru. You need to launch a massive sterilization campaign, and we'll fund it. And the United Nations will come in and serve as the technical secretary for your sterilization campaign. Well, President Fujimori accepted the money. He accepted the technical advisors, some of whom came from the United Nations, some of whom came from China. And he embarked on a sterilization campaign that sterilized hundreds of thousands of women. Well, it turned out that a lot of the sterilizations were done under duress, that women were simply told to report to the local clinic and ordered to undergo sterilization. They were told if they didn't report, their food subsidy from the government would stop. If they didn't report for sterilization, they would not be given any other health care if they or their children became ill. Doctors were told they had a quota of 2 women to bring in a month to be sterilized. If they failed to meet their quota, they could lose their jobs. Nurses who worked for the government were told the same thing. So there was a system of targets and quotas to force women to come in for sterilizations to prevent them from conceiving and bearing children. We found Population Research Institute, which has been in existence since 1989, has investigated programs all around the world, in Vietnam, in India, in Peru, in other Latin American countries, and other African countries. And what we've been able to document in over 40 countries is that when the United States, the UN, and the European Union comes into a country and says, you have too many people, and we're going to help you solve the problem. First of all, you need to have a population control program in place. We'll help you design it. And once you decide how many people you really want in your country and how far you want to reduce the birth rate, we'll fund the program, and we'll send you all of the abortion equipment, all of the sterilization equipment that you need to carry out the program. In other words, we're in the business not of promoting democracy around the world and of human rights around the world in all cases. We've been in the business as a country of promoting population control, which means forced abortion, forced sterilization, forced contraception for the last 50 years. Most Americans don't know anything about the programs. So we've been trying to highlight them, and we've been trying to convince the U.S. government to spend the money that it's spending on coercion, on forcing the birth rate down, on things like providing primary health care. Because the secret here, the not so hidden secret, is that if you provide primary health care to people in the third world and help to reduce the infant and child mortality rate so that half their children don't die before the age of 5, guess what? In a few years, they start having fewer children naturally. The reason why couples, for example, in Nigeria are still having 5 children is because they know they will lose 1 or 2 or 3 of those children before they reach puberty.
Right.
So if we can simply increase access to primary health care and stop typhus, typhoid, malaria, provide clean drinking water, stop babies from dying of amoebic dysentery, for example, we can bring down the infant mortality rate, and then the birth rate will come down naturally. That's called the demographic transition. It's what the U.S. went through. It's what every developed country has gone through. First, the death rate drops, and a few years later, the birth rate starts to follow. Human beings are rational creatures. They want to have 2 or 3 children on average survive to adulthood, and they'll do anything they need to do to get that number if they're given the opportunity.
Sure. Another factor, of course, in a lot of these traditional societies is they don't have Social Security programs and all this sort of thing. Your children are your retirement fund. They're the people who are going to take care of you when you get old. So I think that's a motivating factor as well. Well, this is really appalling stuff. And I mean, as I did some research into things like eugenics and so forth to prepare for this interview, it's not, to be perfectly honest, a subject on which I've dwelt a lot. But I was very shocked to learn the degree to which, as you said, many of these ideas originated not in places like India and China or wherever, but actually originated in the West and in the United States. And in fact, the degree to which the U.S. in the not-so-distant past practiced coercive sterilization in the name of eugenic policies in many states and so forth, and so forth and so on. Obviously, in many countries, Sweden, for example, which we often tend to consider to be a civilized country, in fact, practiced coercive sterilization for decades, beginning in the 1930s. And it's a profoundly dark and negative view of humanity. Due to my upbringing, I was exposed to a lot of these ideas, and I remember reading an article in Audubon magazine back in the mid-'80s when AIDS was all the talk. And the substance of the article, which was absolutely appalling, was, AIDS is actually a good thing because it's going to depopulate Africa and India and places like this, and so it's going to do this needed work of reducing, all this unwanted humanity. And then, of course, we have people like yourself and your organization who see human beings as a blessing, and who see human society and progress, including population growth, as being positive things, because every new baby born could make who knows what contributions they can make. I really appreciate the time you've spent with us, Stephen. This has been just marvelous stuff. Is there anything else you'd like to add? We have a minute or two left.
Well, as a believing Christian, I believe that God created the world for the purpose of allowing humanity to not only survive, but to thrive. And remember, the first commandment given our first parents was to be fruitful and multiply.
Absolutely.
The Bible tells us that children are blessings and not burdens. And I think that people need to remember that every stomach comes with two hands attached, that every mouth is backed by a creative intelligence that can use the resources that God really pre-positioned on the planet to improve life for themselves and their families and their community if they're given the opportunity. And when governments start to intervene in those decisions, and when a few remote bureaucrats living thousands of miles away think that they can run your life better than you, the first thing that happens, of course, is they begin to see you as a burden for them and think about reducing your numbers, not their numbers. So when anybody ever tells you the world is overpopulated, the first thing you ought to say in response is, are you part of the problem?
Are you volunteering to be euthanized?
Are you part of the problem of overpopulation? If not, why not?
Yeah. Well, the world we live in today truly has a larger population than in all of human history. It also has the highest standard of living ever seen. Average people, even in countries outside the United States, enjoy, blessings of prosperity and so forth that were unimagined by kings and sultans only a few generations ago, thanks to things like cell phones and automobiles and so forth and so on. We live in such a remarkable time, and it's a shame that there are people, and particularly people in power, who seem to put a negative cast on it and want to push us backwards rather than forwards. I don't fully understand it. I wish we had more time to talk about this, but we're about out of time. We've enjoyed the insights of Stephen Mosher of the Population Research Institute. Stephen, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon, and we hope to have you back.
Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I'm the host of IMTV's daily talk show about news and events in America. And I want to say a good word for the New American Magazine. Not only because Alex Newman has joined us as somebody who is periodically hosting a show, but because New American Magazine represents a alternative media that is willing to tell people the truth. With so much fake news spreading about, and the fact that right now this country's in an existential crisis, we remember who we are and where we come from and what our principles are, or we die. Reading New American Magazine can keep you up to the minute on the issues that are challenging us as a people and on which that survival hangs. You can check it out and subscribe at www.thenewamerican.com.
As a lumberjack, I've been cutting wood for decades. My job is pretty straightforward. I see the wood, I chop the wood. My axe goes through every time. You remember when everyone bought all the toilet paper? And they wanted me to wear these things? And someone invested a lot of money into this stuff. They say I'm part of a global plan. I don't think so. It's too hot, it's too cold. You know what? The weather changes. We even hear crazy ideas on how kids should learn.
Here's the news, Dad.
Is it, son? Is it?
What about this one, Dad?
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
Visit thenewamerican.com and subscribe to get 50% off the cover price. And if you want an even better deal, use the promo code 10OFFSUB. Again, that's 10OFFSUB for more than 50% off.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. And the truth behind the public school situation in the United States is very dire. Joining me right now is Communications Director for the John Birch Society, Mr. Paul Dragoo, to discuss a lot of what's going on in our public schools. Welcome to the program, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
It's great to see you. I understand that there is something very exciting happening in relation to public schooling in Congressman Thomas Massie's Kentucky. Can you fill us in on that?
Sure. Congressman Massie has sponsored a bill to end the Department of Education. It's a very long bill, all of one sentence, at least the last time I checked. And it said the Department of Education shall terminate on December 31st, 2023. It has actually 20 co-sponsors. So that's really good. Obviously, there's probably no chance of it getting signed into law, but this is a really, really good sign. We view public education or government brainwashing, as it most likely is for anyone who actually looks into it, as a serious issue, if not one of the most foundational issues to restoring and preserving liberty in the United States. We have published quite a bit. By we, I mean the New American, John Birch Society has published quite a bit of information showing that government education, government brainwashes is just that. It's a lot of people don't know. We believe that if enough people actually knew the harms and the reasons that government schools were created, there would be more of them pulling them out. People like the engineers of public education were Horace Mann and John Dewey and others who were blatant socialists, and they looked at having this centralized education apparatus, federal education apparatus, as a way to create docile, obedient adults who would then embrace and help create a socialist America that could then be and submerge under a socialist type one world government. For a lot of people, it may sound crazy. But, there is a whistleblower, and I'm sure you've heard of her, Charlotte Iserbyt. She wrote the book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. She was actually there for those first couple years of the Department of Education, and she got fired for leaking documents, internal documents, showing that is exactly the plan. I like to quote just one sentence from her book, which I think really captures what this is about. And she says, "I want them, being parents, to know that if the government schools are allowed to teach children K through 12 using Pavlovian, Skinnerian animal training methods, which provide tangible rewards only for correct answers, there can be no freedom, because people trained, not educated by such educational techniques, will be fearful of taking principled, sometimes controversial stands when called for, because these people will have been programmed to speak up only if a positive reward or response is forthcoming." How crazy is that? When Rebecca, did we see a lack of principled resistance recently?
Oh, well, I mean, let me count the ways, right? And let's also talk about the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to raise adults who practice virtue and become godly adults, serve God. If the final ultimate goal of education is not God, it's not education. It's like you said in the intro, it's brainwashing.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we've seen here. But it's very, very interesting. People don't understand this long history. You bring up the names Horace Mann and John Dewey. They're probably familiar to most people's ears, but people don't know how long ago this started. Early 1800s.
Yeah.
Horace Mann in Massachusetts, he gave up his career to subvert education. He really did.
It's a foreign model that he brought in, right? It's a Prussian model that he brought in for this.
That's right. And then his kind of, so to speak, spiritual son, John Dewey, did probably the greatest damage. He went over to Russia, set up the public school education underneath the Bolshevik regime, and then came back over here and mimicked it in the United States. Is that an accurate telling of what happened?
I think so. I'm not that familiar with that part, but going back to what you're saying, as far as we know in the history here in the United States, when schools were being set up by local communities, even all the way up to the states, it was to help children learn how to read so they can read scriptures. We know that Yale and Harvard were set up as kind of theological seminaries. That's initially what they were set up with. Over time, as it became more centralized, that obviously we started to get away from that. But also, like you said, this has been happening for a long time. I think a lot of people know now how harmful schools are. Of course, there's been this massive influx to homeschooling and private schools. I think we went from like 2 million to like 3.71 million of homeschoolers during the pandemic. But again, like you said, this has been happening for a long time. And we can look at the way that the values have changed. For instance, but when we delved away from values, a lack of values, inserting values in schools, we went through this moral relativism phase, right? Where it's like there's no good, there's no bad. It's just like, again, moral relativism. But notice how now that we've totally gotten rid of God and we went neutral, or supposedly, now we're back on the value system, but the values is completely contrary to where they started as education. It's completely contrary, anti-Christian, anti-God, all the values that we're seeing now.
Well, I would even go so far as to say demonic, because honestly, there's no vacuum. We asked God to leave back in the 60s, and he's not going to stick around. He's a dignified gentleman. And what we opened the door to then was exactly what we're seeing today. You could have predicted it back then if you'd had your moral compass out.
I believe we did, the Motor Read Action Project. But anyway,
exactly. Well, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about what the John Birch Society, we've had an ongoing action project on this topic for a long, long time.
Yeah. Well, we've had various action projects and we've brought attention to this. In the 70s, we had Motor Read, which was an acronym for expelling the sexualization in schools. And so we really raised the alarms about that. And of course, they kept going. But we have what's called a Save Our Children from Public Schools action campaign, and it focuses on three things. We try to keep things simple because there's a lot going on, but we try to, first and foremost, we say that the most important thing you can do as a parent is actually get them out of public schools. We make the case that these are not, first of all, they're not there to educate. There was an article yesterday or the other day reported about how in Chicago schools they learned that there's nobody proficient in math and reading. I believe, and that's just a snippet of what's really going on there. The Nation's Report Card, which is the government's own assessment of itself, reports that no academic category has a more than half percentage. Half of the students are proficient in. So less than half the students in public education throughout the United States are proficient in any one category. So it's an abject failure just from academic-wise. But obviously, as we mentioned before, they are now in the business of implementing values, and like you said, demonic values. And we are seeing the fruits of that. So you must get them out. And then secondly, we say that getting them out then the result starts to defund the Department of Education. You know, we were talking about that bill at the beginning. Fat chance it has of being, getting through even the Senate. Obviously, it's not going to get through the Senate if it were even to get through the House, and obviously not signed. But we don't have to wait for that bill to get. We start pulling those kids out, and it starts defunding. All of a sudden, the feds because they send per student, so they send less to the states. And then the third, and I consider this really, I think we consider it really important because we put it in there, is we need to get our faith leaders involved in this battle because they're influencers in their communities. And for instance, in our community, my wife homeschools our 11-year-old, and we've been doing so for a couple of years. And one of the things that the church does in our community is it opens its door on a weekly basis, and all the homeschool kids, the homeschool moms, they come together and they get the kids together, and the kids play and they do art, whatever. So that's one way they do social time. There's a lot of ways, by the way, not that we have time for it, but there's a lot of ways that homeschool parents are figuring out ways, because what the pushback she'll get is the whole socialization argument, which is obviously ridiculous because nobody can socialize now anyway.
Right. It's a lie. It absolutely is a lie because, I mean, all of my nieces and nephews have been homeschooled. They are the most socialized creatures, but they also know how to think properly. They know how to identify things in society that are wrong without the adults or anyone else around them telling. So, there's that old saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Right now, our federal government is rocking the cradle.
Oh, yeah.
We need to get back to basics. We need to get back to where moms can stay at home. I know that there are a lot of moms who want to stay at home with their kids, and they can't afford it because our society, our whole economy is set up is anti-family. Setting families up for disaster, and hand your kids over to us. We'll take care of them. Yes, we're getting gender confusion, we're getting white shaming, we're getting everything that goes along with Common Core,
revisionist history.
There you go. Exactly. We're both thinking the same thing at the same time. We have a minute left. Paul, give everybody information on how they can learn more, where they need to go online.
Sure. Well, you go to jbs.org. That's usually where you can find all our stuff. And then you go under action projects and you'll see Save Our Children in the drop down. And there we provide synopsis of what's going on, what's wrong, why these government education is so harmful. And then we provide ideas of what you can do. Just get them out, how to defund, how to get your pastors, your clergymen involved. But this, first and foremost, parents need to realize this needs to happen. And I think we first and foremost have to drive home the point that government schools are not what you think they are, and they are far more destructive than you know. And I think once people start to realize that, then all those things are going to start to take place. You're going to see more pull out.
Amen. Absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for your insights today. We are out of time for this entire week of the New American TV. We encourage everyone to visit us at jbs.org and thenewamerican.com. We will see you back here on Monday.